Hi, Switch viewers. Welcome to our live today about how the body holds trauma. Please ask questions. Let me know where you're from. We have people from all over the world listening, and we will go through everything and anything you want to know, and I will start with that. So welcome, and we look forward to answering your questions, and make sure you watch hopefully until the end. We always have a great free gift, and I know that we'll drop the link in the chat and for the survey and follow that along, and then we will send you a gift. So with that, let's get started. So make sure to say hi and let me know where you're from. And with that, we'll begin about treating our body with the same respect that we treat our friends and our loved ones, and how we look at our emotional self and the way that trauma impacts us will also affect how we hold our physical self and also what's stored in our body. And a lot of times we call that somatic. So bear with me as I look over to see, hi, Jamie from New York, Naveed's chiming in from British Columbia, and Anne from Dutchess County. We have a couple other people from New York and from the San Francisco Bay Area. Me too, Anne, yay, California. Somebody from Alaska, Maddie. So someone coming in from Michigan, Danny from the UK. So hi, everybody. Thanks continuing to say hi. Let me know. Someone else from Michigan. I love to know where you're coming from. It makes it super exciting. And so please ask questions if you're joining us now. What do you want to know about the body and trauma? And then, as always, I have some slides, and we'll definitely give you some tips and some skills on how to work with trauma in the body. Also, Susie from the Bay Area, someone from Arizona, Tennessee. So thanks. Yeah, Naveed, it is late for people calling in from the UK. So with that, let's get started. And again, please don't feel shy about dropping comments and things into the chat. And we'll move to the next slide. And the next slide says, your illness does not define you. Your strength and your courage does. And so much of what we talk about with trauma is that we feel physically and emotionally, and then cognitively in the way that we think about things. We really experience trauma on this multifaceted component. And a lot of times we don't have words for our traumatic experiences. We have feelings, and we put words into those feelings, and based on how we are emotionally experiencing, but also how we're physically experiencing things. And so really what we're remembering is remembering the details of the trauma and how it makes us emotionally and physically feel. And then the memory is actually what we call in narrative therapy, a story. And so we fill in the blanks. And so sometimes when we start talking about trauma, what we're talking about is actually what we're physically feeling, and not necessarily what we're really remembering as a total experience. And so if that doesn't make sense, please ask for clarification, and we'll jump into the next slide. And so a lot of times with our body and the way that we hold trauma, it feels like anxiety. And so a lot of times people will talk about, I feel like I'm panicked, I feel like I'm having anxiety. Most of the time people have stomach upset, and so heart races, sweaty palms. And so we have a lot of these physical components to it. Some people feel pain, some people feel nothing at all. And so we hold this, and we usually will just say, well, I feel anxious or I feel worried, but not necessarily that my body is re-experiencing trauma. And so I bring this slide in about anxiety and how anxiety affects us in the stomach and our GI issues, because so much of the time when we have trauma, our body's going to hold it in our stomach and hold it in our muscles. And so we're going to really seize everything up. We might clench our jaw. Sometimes, like I definitely get that furrowed brow. Sometimes people get that. Their shoulders get really tight. And so a lot of times how we experience trauma will also be the way that we experience it in our body. And yes, Jamie, I would love to give you an example. If you could please give me a little bit more information on what kind of example. Yes, Tara, we will be going over how to release trauma in the body toward the end of our presentation. So first, we'll talk about how it manifests in the body and then actually how to work with that. So thank you for asking. And yes, I'm happy to give examples of trauma and how we hold trauma in the body. And so I think based on what I previously said before the anxiety slide, when we have, for example, if you've ever been in a car and you're driving and you're at a stoplight and you have your hands on your wheel, on the steering wheel, and you look in the rearview mirror, whether you've been rear-ended or not, and the car's coming up really fast behind you, you'll notice that your whole body kind of has that startle response and your muscles will tense. Your body floods with about 30 different stress hormones. And you have this whole physical reaction, and it feels like it's simultaneous with an emotional reaction. So some people will say that they have an emotional reaction and then the physical one, but most people will say that they have this physical reaction and then we feel fear, anxiety, oh my gosh, I might be hit. And so we start to flood with this emotional feeling, and then the cognitive thought of what happens if I get hit, they're going to ruin my car, I don't know where my insurance, whatever it is, we start to flood. But what happens is our body experiences it as a whole body experience. And so then every time you're at a stoplight, especially if it was really a scary experience, you're holding on to the steering wheel, you look in the rearview mirror, and when you see that car approaching, even if they're not approaching fast, your whole body's going to have that same kind of a reaction. And so that's an example of how our body can hold something that is traumatic, even though we may not log it. So if I were to ask you in therapy, hey, have you ever been rear-ended? You would say, maybe, for example, no, that's never happened to me. You're not necessarily tracking that you're having a physical reaction every time you're watching a car race up behind you and then stop, even if you've never been hit. So I think, Jamie, that's an example of what you're talking about, of how we hold the body. And yes, Nilda and Amanda, that's why we either some people lose their appetite, some people have GI stress, some people have constipation, diarrhea, vomiting. They're sensitive to foods at times and not to others. And good, Jamie, I'm glad that was super, super helpful. And yes, Pamela, with the driving example, over time, the fear gets more and more pronounced as we do have, I don't want to necessarily say chronologically older, but as we have more experience. So if you had that experience happen when you first learned how to drive and then it doesn't happen for 5 or 6 years, you may not log it in the same way as if it happens to you and you're almost hit, or even if it was a small, even just a fender bender, it becomes more fearful over time. And part of that is because with trauma, what we're remembering is how we feel emotionally and physically. And so we remember the whole total experience. And so the next time we are in an environment that reminds us of, it doesn't even have to be the same thing, that it reminds us of that experience, what we're remembering is the memory of what happened. So let's say that with that driving experience, that's happened to you a half a dozen times. The first time it wasn't as bad as the second, and the second wasn't as bad as the fourth, and the fourth wasn't it. So it builds over time. And so it feels so much bigger because we're remembering not just how we physically felt, but how we emotionally felt as well. So we're remembering the whole experience with that. And so then if we move to the next slide, how does stress show up in your body? And so stress can be a version of trauma, post-traumatic stress, that's different than post-traumatic stress disorder. So post-traumatic stress is trauma-based. Disorder means when it affects your daily life and living. And so part of it is when we look at stress and anxiety, sometimes those are interwoven with trauma and sometimes they're not. So all of these different things can be a manifestation of stress. It can be a manifestation of anxiety, but it can definitely be a manifestation of trauma. And so sometimes our body's telling us that things are traumatic, even though we emotionally don't log that it's traumatic, or we're unaware of it, which means that it's logged into our subconscious. Moving on to the next slide. So these are just different ways that trauma can show up in our body. So the car example is one where there's something that we perceive to be scary or harmful, and that becomes traumatic. There are other things that, you know, in the world of psychology, when I say the world of psychology, we used to say things were big T traumas or little t traumas. And what that meant was something like a minor car accident might be considered a little t trauma, where a major car accident where somebody was seriously injured would be considered a big T trauma. We have on that list things like emotional abuse. For some people, COVID has been traumatic, to things like war, rape, violence. And so trauma is really a spectrum, and that's the way that I like to see it. And oftentimes when clients are coming in, they want to know if something they're experiencing is traumatic. And my response always is I may not have had that experience. It may not be traumatic for me, but it could absolutely be traumatic for you. And so yes, Cheryl, grief can absolutely cause traumatic symptoms, especially if it's something around the unexpected, whether that's loss or whether that it's somebody who is terminally ill that one loses over time. It could be the grief of losing a pet. It could be grief from losing a job. The isolation, again, with what we've been experiencing worldwide with this pandemic, people report grief and from isolation and missing friends and family, and that absolutely can be traumatic. So again, I look at trauma as in the eyes of the beholder. And so really for today's talk, we're talking about how our body manifests that. And so some of it's fatigue. Some of it can show up with eating disorders or things like body dysmorphia, where we don't actually have a real image of what we look like. And so people who've experienced abuse, physical trauma, serious accident where there's a loss of use of limb or loss of limb, sight, any kind of sensory loss. People have early childhood trauma with abuse. They can develop this sense of my body is not doing or appearing or responding the way that I think it should, or I want it to, or I have an unrealistic image of what my body actually is or is doing based on my traumatic experience. And so I'm just going to take a pause so I can read some of these amazing comments. And so yes, feeling sick from stress, and stress can be a precursor to trauma. So somebody who has trauma can have chronic stress, and someone who has chronic stress can develop trauma-like symptoms in the way that the body holds that. And Anita, I have lots of love that I'm sending you. Anita says she lost both parents suddenly and traumatically, and her body is still processing the trauma. Yes, absolutely. And some of it is with grief, shock, loss, trauma, and what we call, complicated bereavement. It means that there's something traumatic around that, and it's not, it takes a long time, and there's so much pain, the loss of a dream, all of those things go into how your body is going to hold that, and how it manifests, and it can result in things like dysmorphia, fatigue, similar stress, anxiety symptoms. And it does take a long time for the body to process it. And that's because we don't really have words. We know how we physically feel, and we can attach an emotion to that feeling, but we don't necessarily have a monologue or dialogue to be able to explain what's happening. And so our body's going to hold on to that memory and hold on to the trauma so much longer than maybe sometimes even our emotional grief processing. And Sharon said, yes, the combination of small T traumas can become large T traumas. Yes, and that's we call the difference between something like post-traumatic stress versus post-traumatic stress disorder when it affects your daily life and living, and then complex post-traumatic stress disorder, where someone who, for example, who has had a parent that's yelled at them or was verbally or emotionally abusive, one or two incidents may not be logged as bigger T trauma, but years of that kind of abuse can become overwhelmingly big trauma. So yes, that's absolutely correct. And so yes, having a violent childhood. Also, thank you for pointing that out, Elizabeth. Also, we don't necessarily think of gaslighting, toxic positivity, and just passive aggressive emotional abuse as turning into trauma, but it absolutely does. And so when we're experiencing relationships, whether they're parental, romantic, work, friendship, where we've decided they're sort of toxic relationships, over time, that manifests as trauma. So yes, all of these things that you're putting into the chat are all different ways that trauma manifests in the body. And when we have abuse, and we have abuse to our person, whether that's physical abuse or sexual abuse, we tend to hold our bodies differently. And when we have physical injury, so I'm a retired athlete. I was a retired ballerina and then decided to be a therapist. That's a whole nother story for a whole nother day. But I had a lot of body betrayal. I felt like my body got older. I had more injuries, and I couldn't do what my profession was. And so some of that was very traumatic for me. There was a lot of trauma around those injuries for me. And that became a sense of body betrayal. And so it can show up in all different ways. We'll flip to the next slide. Yes, and yes, thank you, Anita, for pointing that out in the chat. With, it's always multifaceted, and I say always because even when we think of something like, I got into, I'm making a story up. I had an argument with a friend, and it was heartbreaking to me. We don't necessarily see that heartbreak as trauma, but it can be very traumatic, and it can take time for us to work through that over a long period of time. And so we look at that as an isolated incident. We don't see that that stacks up with maybe I lost my job, and maybe my best friend moved away, and like all of these different little pieces start to stack up, and they become more and more traumatic, and our body holds that tighter and tighter. And so all of the symptoms that we feel with these single incidents start to stack, and we feel them repetitively over time. Burnout is another example of how our body holds trauma, exhaustion, that irritability, the decrease in performance, that reduced creativity, the nausea and upset, chronic aches and pains, and also illness, chronic illness and injury can be traumatic, and our body will hold that. And for some of us, getting older is something that can go into that body betrayal and feel like we don't have control. And so anytime we feel like we're out of control, we definitely move into this trauma-based response. And then we can slip to the next slide. Yes, recovering from divorce, and Joanne says, feels like going into shock. And yes, that's a really good example. Thank you. Forgive me if I mispronounce your name. Nilda says Black trauma. Yes, intergenerational trauma, interracial trauma. Depending on what country you're in, there can be trauma from politics. So all of these things affect us, and sometimes it's important to just unplug and disconnect, because it will absolutely build and continue to build. And so we learn traumatic responses if we don't necessarily determine that we've had trauma in our family. If we have a family member, usually a parent or a grandparent, that has had trauma, those traumatic responses or learned responses are passed down from generation to generation. And again, our body holds all of that. And we learn these responses because we watch our family members, our caretakers, our parents, our romantic partners that may have had trauma have these physical responses. And so children learn those responses. That becomes part of their everyday today. And so yes, being stuck in flight, fight, or freeze. And so that absolutely is what we're talking about when we look at this next slide, with hyperarousal versus tolerance and hypoarousal. And so with trauma, most people are in this hyperarousal state all the time. And so when you think about driving in the car and you have that kind of, jerk reaction, you move into hyperarousal. Your body floods, that fight, flight, freeze, or that autonomic nervous system, your ANS, kick off. And all of this part in the back of your head, we used to call it our reptilian brain. It's our hippocampus and amygdala. All of those things start to fire off, and our body starts to respond. So we move into this hyperarousal, fight, flight, freeze symptom. And reaction. So we move into this hyperarousal reaction, and that keys off the fight, flight, freeze. So it's what we call a negative feedback loop. So one starts the other, and then the other one feeds into it. So fight, flight, freeze feeds into hyperarousal, which feeds into fight, flight, freeze, and we get stuck in this cycle. And so then every time you're driving in the car, you see the car come fast in your rearview mirror, you have this hyperarousal response. The more times that happens, the more you are staying in a state of hyperarousal. So one of the things that our body does with trauma is that it keeps us in this hyperarousal or fight, flight, freeze response as our baseline, because that's what keeps us safe. And so when you think about that, it's actually a really normal response, right? Our defense mechanism, the fight, flight, freeze response, keeps us safe. It makes us feel like we have more control. When we feel like we have more control, we really are able to control our experience, especially our physical experience of trauma. At least we think so. So we think that our cognitive, and our thinking mind starts to control our body. And so we keep that going. And so this hyperarousal actually makes us feel safe. What we don't realize is that we're fueling all of the physical or somatic body responses that we're trying to heal. So we're holding ourselves tighter, we're not breathing well, we're not using our whole breath, so we have shallow breathing. headache, fatigue, I think someone pointed out in here. Yes, Tara, chronic fatigue, all of those things we become less in tune with, even though they're happening constantly, because we're in this hyper arousal, fight, flight, freeze response constantly. And so the idea isn't to get rid of it. And so I like to use the analogy of a light switch, where when you have trauma and you have physical response, it's almost like you click the switch on. And so it's on, and it's on all the time. And what I'd like everyone to challenge themselves with and to think about is building in sort of a dimmer switch. And so when it's there, when you're driving in the car, you probably want to be more alert than when you're sitting at home on the couch watching television. And so for some people, that hyperarousal never turns off, even when they're at home. And so starting to bring that down so you have access to it when you need it. The fight, flight, freeze keeps you safe. And at the same time, when you don't need it as much, when you're feeling more comfortable, you're more okay in that sense of vulnerability or authenticity physically and emotionally, that hyper arousal comes down to tolerance. And then we can move to the next slide, please. So part of this is becoming really aware of what's happening in our body. And someone asked about skills in the beginning, and yes, we'll go through skills. So yoga, stretching, guided meditation, progressive relaxation. There's a lot of great free apps. Journaling, if you look at all of the different Switch products, and we have a lot of different lives and podcasts, anything that's meditation or movement based helps us get into our body. The more that we get into our body, the easier it is for us to sit with how we're physically feeling. And so a lot of times when we experience trauma, a lot of people will say, I feel numb or I feel flat. And so they don't necessarily know how they emotionally feel. And if we ask, okay, what do you physically feel? Where are you feeling in your body? Some people will say, I just don't, I don't necessarily feel anything. I have a headache all the time. I'm fatigued all the time. I have nausea, but I don't necessarily feel anything in my body. And so that discomfort is really tricky to work with. And so we want to start really slowly. And so we want to be able to learn how to be in our body more and notice what's bubbling up, what we're feeling, without trying to attach what we say story. That's not a dismissive term, it's a narrative therapy term. So what's that narrative story? What's the details that we're attaching to our physical response? And is that a true response, or is it something that we're kind of overinflating? Because again, our flight, fight, freeze mechanism is on hyper alert. So when you start getting into your body, those danger signs and flooding, chemical biochemistry flooding is going to start happening, because that's what keeps us safe. And so it's this weird mechanism that keeps us sort of in our body, but not necessarily really experiencing it all the time. And so it's really hard sometimes to access what's happening in our body through words. So feeling it is one way to start very gently easing into that without being completely overwhelmed or feeling over traumatized. And then we can move on. And if people have more questions or more experiences, please, by all means, let me know in the chat. And so, yeah, Tara's saying that I totally have that numb feeling. I know when my stomach bothers me and the fatigue, but nothing else. And that's really common. Most people are able to identify stress, fatigue, anxiety, stomach issues, GI issues, and that numb, that disconnect feeling more than anything else. Challenge yourself and see, like, are you clenching your teeth? I'm always surprised that how tightly I'm holding my jaw and I don't even realize it. Or I'm holding my shoulders even when I'm driving or I'm doing something. I've got my shoulders up in my ears. So sometimes I have to check in with myself and say, okay, take a breath, relax my shoulders, roll my head a little bit, wiggle my fingers, kind of get some body awareness back into my mind or my cognitive awareness, because I'm not aware of what I'm physically doing, open up my jaw, things like that. Because we don't actually realize how much our body is responding to it. We've just started to tune that off. And then another question came in is, can the fight, flight, freeze be turned off, and how do we learn how to do that? This is such a great question. Our flight, fright, freeze mechanism is what keeps us safe. And so if you think about driving or walking down the street late at night or being in a crowded area, if that mechanism turned off, then you wouldn't necessarily have anything to keep you safe. And we talk a lot about intuition, and that's sort of that intuition of, I get this physical or body reaction and feeling around different environments. And we look at that sometimes as our intuition. And so the idea isn't necessarily to get rid of the fight, flight, or freeze. It's to, like I said, with that dimmer switch, it's kind of to take it down a few notches. So it's there when you need it. It's just not there on overdrive all the time. And so if you think about just bringing it down a little bit and again, getting into the body and using those progressive relaxation skills about being aware of your body can help ease that fight, flight, freeze a little bit, and then using some mindful redirection. Am I safe? Am I, do I have all of the things that I need? Do I need to make some changes to my physical environment right now? And then if you do that, you act on that to keep yourself safe. And if you don't, then using some positive reinforcement and reframing of, I'm okay, take a deep breath, right? And then I continue forward. We want to stay out of why. Why is this happening to me? Anytime we're in why questions, we start that processing or that spinning all over again, and that hyper awareness, hyper arousal goes way up. And so then our fight, flight, freeze system kicks into gear. And so the goal is that we don't take it down to where it doesn't exist, it doesn't keep us safe, that we start using positive reinforcement in our cognitive thinking to help our body calm down a little bit. And so we'll jump to the next slide, and I'll try and get caught up with these chats. And so can witnessing domestic violence as a child cause physical symptoms as an adult? Absolutely. So anything that's happened in early childhood, unless we've worked through that in therapy, will be there as an adult. And even when we do work through that in therapy, we are fine-tuned or calibrated to look for those things. So we look for examples in people that we witnessed that we determined were unsafe, and also became very unsafe for us and as humans. And so we hold that in our physical memory, not in our conscious memory. And when something makes us have that fight, flight, freeze reaction, our body's going to respond first. So for example, if somebody who's witnessed domestic violence, if they see someone arguing, they're already going to move into hypervigilant. And what they're looking for is that physical response in their own body to give them direction to what they're witnessing. And so it's that narrative or that story that we've created meaning in our mind, and then we become very hyper aware of what's happening in the world around us, and that only solidifies our body's memory of the events that we witnessed as a young child, even if we don't actually have memory of it. So a lot of times, remember that your memory is how you physically feel and what you think about it and the emotions that it creates. It's not always what the incident was. So sometimes we're holding all of these things that we've experienced in young childhood, but we don't actually have the language to put this happened, then this happened, then this happened, to have a factual recollection. So what we're remembering is how we physically feel. And yes, massage is great if people have the resources. Massage, acupressure, acupuncture, all of those things, functional chiropractic, all of these kinds of things help the body. Cranial sacral techniques, which is a very specific kind of body therapy, like Reiki, or EMDR, eye movement rapid desensitization for trauma specifically, is all about what's happening in the body and releasing the body experience, not so much talking about the experience. So typically talk therapy is talking about the trauma and working through the physical response through talking about it. And techniques that we call somatic based or physical based techniques like EMDR or somatic experiencing use trauma work on how the body is experiencing and processing the trauma, and working on releasing the trauma in the body and helping the mind reprocess the experience. And so exercise is always helpful to learn how to get into the body when we're experiencing trauma. And exercise doesn't mean go work out at the gym 5 days a week for an hour at a time. Exercising can be taking a stroll around the neighborhood. It could be housework. It could be gardening. It could be walking your pet. It could be going to the gym. It can be all sorts of things, but really it's moving your body and becoming aware, and then just feeling it, really feeling in the body helps. And experiencing. And so if you're doing yoga or you're taking a walk, really paying attention to your sensation. What's the color of the sky? What's the temperature? What smells do you notice? Are there flowers and trees? Do they have a scent? What do you hear? So really paying attention to your experience in the body will help you learn how to sit in the body. And that also helps to start to rewrite some of the traumatic experiences, because we use that sensation recognition as what we call indexing. So we can come back to say, I remember what roses smell like. I love the smell of fresh flowers. And so when I'm feeling trauma in my body, I can go back to, okay, remember the smell of fresh flowers, and that can help bring that anxiety and trauma back down. And so you're moving out of that hyperarousal state. And then we can move to the next slide. And so really with trauma, what happens is most people report that they have a lot of shame and guilt and feelings of betrayal. So they experience trauma, they feel ashamed of their experiences, and that's really about who we are. We can feel guilt about how we perceive our body, what we put our body through or don't put our body through. Yes, shutting down and going to sleep is that fight, flight, freeze response. And so we absolutely do that when we're overwhelmed and our body is completely flooded with stress hormones. We can shut down and fall asleep, and that can be a trauma response. And yes, somebody asked earlier in the chat if having relatives with bipolar can result in childhood trauma. Absolutely. Remember, anything that is traumatic that you as a person have identified that is traumatic for you can result in holding trauma in the body, not just emotionally or in our memory as well. So yes, all of these things can be traumatic. And that shutdown and going to sleep response is one that's actually more common than we think. Our body just gets so overwhelmed that we shut down. Our mind and our emotional state actually can't keep up with our physical reaction. And so that's part of what happens. So our body's designed, that's our defense mechanism with that fight, flight, freeze. That's part of the freeze response, is our body just taps out and goes, okay, I'm done. Shut it down. Try to go to sleep now. And so, these are some mantras in this slide, and we'd be happy to share slides with you and at the end as well. But things that really working on body acceptance and getting out of the shame can also help our body begin to release some of the trauma. And we can move on to the next slide, and same thing about loving your body. Sharon from SoCal. Hi, Sharon. I'm chiming in from Northern California in the San Francisco Bay Area. Binge watching TV, playing games on my phone. Yeah, it's checking out. And so what happens is we can't feel it anymore. It's either we're so numb or we're so uncomfortable that we do anything to check out. Overwork, binge eat, binge watch TV, video games, exercise, never wanting to be alone, needing to always, talk on the phone, text, be with people. All of those things are different ways that we check out from physically feeling the trauma. And those also help us to check out from emotionally experiencing it as well. So yes, all of those things can be be a traumatic response, but be part of the ways that we learn to cope. So a lot of these things are coping mechanisms, which makes sense. If you've experienced trauma, re-experiencing that all of the time is emotionally, cognitively, physically, and spiritually painful. And so why would we do that? That makes no sense. Why would we keep ourselves in a suspended state of pain? And so we have developed coping mechanisms to keep us out of feeling pain physically and feeling pain emotionally. And so all of these ways that we disengage keep us safe. It also keeps us functional, so we can drive, go to work, and do all of these other things that we have to do in our day-to-day. And so in some ways, right, our body is doing what it's designed to do. It's shutting down, it's beginning to cope because it can't deal with the pain and the trauma anymore. And then at a certain point, it's not helpful. And so the trick is to try and find some coping mechanisms that work better for you. I don't want to say that are perfect or there's the right ones, but coping mechanisms that make you feel better about your physical self and your emotional self. And so sometimes that's, I'm going to allow meditation, at the end of the day. I'm going to unplug and only be on social media for 30 minutes. I'm only going to play, an hour's worth of games, and then I'm going to, go take a shower, make some dinner, take a walk, call a friend, right? So we're learning how to develop new coping strategies before just completely trying to erase the ones that already work. Because part of this is we want to make sure that we stay emotionally safe, but we also stay physically safe. And so our body's going to fight back with us if it feels like it's in danger. And so we have to rewrite those coping mechanisms very slowly. And some actually work really well. And so for the ones that work well and you don't feel like they're negatively impacting your day-to-day, I would suggest keeping those. And we can slip to the next slide. And again, these are more tools for body acceptance. And so body acceptance is the way that I couch working with somatic trauma in our body, is first really working on accepting what our body is doing and understanding our body, and working with that consciously when we're awake. And as we begin to interact with our body more and pay attention to our body more, develop some new habits and coping skills, we're going to notice that some of that trauma is going to start to ease and lighten up. And so the body acceptance tools are one way to access working with the somatic response that is rooted in trauma. And so Anita asks, I find that my subconscious brain can process while I'm sleeping, and when I wake up, I'm calmer. There's a lot of theory behind that. There's a lot of dream science that goes into why we dream and processing while we dream. There's something very specific called ASMR, and you can look for ASMR videos. There's all different kinds, but they're sensory based. And what we know is that helps us calm down. It's the same thing if you've ever taken care of an infant and you have white noise, or you say shh, or you're rocking. All of those things are ways that we subconsciously stimulate developing equilibrium. So, shaking is another way that, I always make jokes about the Taylor Swift song, but I love it, right? Just shake it off. That's another way that we can actually get our body to calm down without having to do any kind of emotional processing. And so that's really important as well. And so using white noise, movement, progressive relaxation, and especially doing that at bedtime. And then when you sleep, yes, your body will go ahead and continue to process that information. And some people report that they'll have nightmares or terrible dreams, and then they feel calmer. And other people report, like you, where they feel calmer right away. And so then we can we can go to the next slide. And yes, Sharon, yes, just rocking. Rocking chairs are great, right? And so there is actual empirically based scientific research that's been done with MRIs, with brain imaging, and rocking and shaking, aromatherapy, and sense it, or kind of a sensation-based therapy to calm the nervous system. And we know that actually works based on brain science. And so rocking is good, and warm shower, cold shower, things like that, we know work really well. But rocking and shaking, and then that progressive relaxation, there's some hard science behind why that works. And those are really great skills to help develop new coping mechanisms. Acupressure, there's different acupressure points. Again, this stuff is all, Google, YouTube, you can find a lot of information on this, but you can do acupressure points on yourself that helps the body calm down and reset. And that's one way that we start to process trauma without developing a verbal narrative or story to that. And so these grounding techniques we're talking about, some of you may have heard it's the 5-4-3-2-1 technique, and we'll go through that. But what we're really doing is, when we're paying attention to our sensations, we're grounding our body. When we ground our body, we're able to sit in our body a little bit longer. And the more we do that, the more we begin to retrust our body, and we start working through some of that trauma that we've experienced. So we can go on to the next slide. And I just bear with me here while I catch up in the chat. So what if you're thinking that you're over trauma, but your body is still holding on to it? Yeah, that's what happens is especially when people have done a lot of talk therapy. And for clients that I work with, I'm a trauma expert. And so I have a lot of clients that come in with exactly the same question. I've been to therapy. I thought I was over it. I did a lot of process work, and yet I still am somatically, or my body's still experiencing this. And the first and foremost is, Angie, is that's normal. And so it's not as simple as 1, 2, 3, and then we just get over something, or we've done therapy, or we've processed it, or we worked through it, or it was a long time ago. Our bodies hold on to this. And so there's a lot of reasons why that happens. The gold standard book still is called The Body Keeps the Score by Dr. Van der Kolk. there's a couple of new podcasts with him that explain why this is the case, but our bodies hold on to it. And until our bodies are able to reprocess the trauma, our bodies will continue to hold on to it. So we may have emotionally processed it. We may have cognitively processed it. We've done talk therapy, and that's worked really well. And then we get to a point in life where maybe we're either re-traumatized or we're re-exposed to something about the trauma. And then all of a sudden we're back in the state of re-experiencing it physically again, or we feel like we're just not over it. And so one of the things that we look at is using non-talk therapies to help our body reprocess the trauma. And what that means is bringing that body awareness into that conscious memory, and that our memory can rewrite and begin to understand the body trauma in a different way. That's what somatic processing is. And that begins to help us sort of rewrite that trauma. And so it's not uncommon for people to say, I'm still physically holding on to it, even though emotionally it doesn't affect me as much. And so checking out some therapy or some other resources might be really beneficial. Usually that's sort of at the end. A lot of times people will have done some really great therapy work. Even if they're doing their own work through journaling, they've done a lot of really great self-work, and then they get to this place where they start to feel stuck in their body. And it's that last little piece. It's like you're so close to being at the end, and your body needs a little bit of a jump start to help get it to reprocess the trauma. Because remember, the body's experiencing it one way, and then the brain is coming in and it's overriding the body experience, and it's giving language to the body experience. So if you had something that happened in early childhood, you remember it as a child. So then the next time you remember it, you remember the experience and how you felt about it as a child. And so if you just take that toward, multiply that by 10 years, by 10 years, by 10 years, what you remember now and how your body feels is memories of the experience. It's not the experience itself necessarily. We've attached more emotion and meaning to it because we understand it. So at every cognitive change, we understand it differently. So what we understood as a 10-year-old is different than a 20-year-old and a 30-year-old, and so on and so forth. And so we're able to add more what we think meaning to it retroactively, right? Or in retrospect, we look back and we like, oh, well, that's what that was, but that's not how our body remembered it. And so part of it is getting back to the root part of the body trauma. And yes, meditation, the vagal nerve toning, that kind of therapy, somatic therapy, EMDR, somatic reprocessing, all of those things work. And they work in conjunction with talk therapy. You don't have to do one or the other. And some therapists like myself have a multimodality approach that works really well. So all of those things are good. And yes, trauma at infancy. So, having babies that were premature, there's a lot of trauma. And yes, the body will hold on to that. What gives it meaning is as a parent, we give dialogue to that, or we give explanations or stories to that. If there's medical or psychiatric conditions, that comes with its own dialogue. And so all of that starts to make meaning out of something that originally doesn't have any cognitive expression. And so our body is holding on to something that our brain's trying to explain. And so I'm just going to catch up with the chat. Bear with me, please. So Tara, I grew up with parents yelling. I noticed when I process trauma, I start to yell and I didn't know why. Yes, is this a form of my body learned as a child? And so now I do it as an adult. Absolutely. So it's learned behavior. That's that generational trauma. There is a part of the brain, and there's some newer research. There's a part of the brain that has a switch. And what happens is when we're re-experiencing trauma, and the yelling is a really good example. It's that concept of if you've ever heard the expression like seeing red. So our body kind of, we disconnect from reality, and sometimes we don't even remember. And so there's a tipping point where I'm agitated, I'm angry, and then all of a sudden I'm starting to yell, but I don't actually remember how I went from being angry to yelling. There's this little time lapse, and that's that body's trauma response happening. And so there's a part of the brain that gets tripped when we're re-experiencing something, and our coping mechanism is learned traumatic responses. And so that may be an explanation of the yelling, but yes, you're correct. That's how that works, is we remember something in our body, and then we're having this emotional or learned behavior, or both, response to it. So let me see if I can catch up. I'm currently reading The Body Keeps the Score. Yeah. It's a gold standard when I teach, and I have a great team that's in their postdoc. It's a mandatory reading for my staff. I recommend it to clients. I recommend that people listen to it. It's very dense, and it is there's a lot there. And so I say, listen, do 20, 30 minutes, just listen to it. If you feel like you can do more, but take it slow. It's a great book. It gives you so much explanation about why our body is doing what it's doing. And I know for me personally, with my own trauma, it was really helpful before I was a therapist, when I first started going to therapy and I was trying to understand all of these things. It helped me understand the mechanism of what was going on for me. And that was helpful, because I felt like if I could understand what my body was going through, I could at least had a starting point for some tools. Yes, Switch has a bunch of really great, they have a lot of really great products, and they're adding new products, new podcasts, new lives all the time. It's a holistic experience. And so doing some talk therapy, journaling, helps you start to access it, even if you're not identifying the specific trauma yet, or you've already identified it. Doing this from a holistic perspective is really important, because we start to figure out what our stress reactions and how our body is reacting, what's good coping mechanisms, what are normal signals that our body is processing well, and then what are these areas that our body is really holding on to. And so picking a place to start is really important. And then the last skill that I would like to leave you with before we have to end our live, this has been amazing, and thank you all for participating. You've had such great insight and feedback, and your vulnerability and willingness to share with those that are tuning in. Thank you. It gives it understanding and breadth and dynamic. And for me personally, I find that cathartic and healing for myself. And I hope that that's a great takeaway from everybody, that that you're not alone. And trauma is trauma, and it manifests in so many different ways. And us coming together, us working together, us being kind, and being willing to share our experiences and vulnerable is one of the ways that we can heal and help each other heal. So thank you for all of you that have been willing to share your stories and ask questions. And for those of you that are tuning in and you're just watching and listening, feel free to to send an email, and if you have questions, I'm happy to ask them. I'm happy to answer them. I'm always happy to ask questions, but I'm happy to answer your questions if you've got them. Yes, subscribe, and we will try and get to as much as we can. So having said that, this HALT technique is the one that works the best. And you can do it anytime, anywhere. And I have this Post-it note. I have several Post-it notes. I'm a big fan of writing myself notes, but I have this one that's really big on my computer. And it really goes like this. Am I angry? Am I hungry? Am I angry? Am I tired? Am I angry? Am I lonely? Am I angry? Am I triggered? Am I angry? Does my stomach hurt? Right? I'm constantly checking in with myself. And what I'll usually find is, for me, the way that my trauma manifests and my fight, flight, freeze, as I either completely shut down, or I find that I feel angry or agitated, and I feel physically in my body agitated. And so now I've learned to check in when I'm feeling that agitation. It's like, okay, am I angry or frustrated, or am I really triggered? Right? Am I having a traumatic response? Am I angry, or am I just hungry or tired? And so this is one of my favorite techniques that I use all the time. And so the idea is that this takes some big belly breaths, that pushes your reset button, and then that positive reframe, which I know Barb Egan talks a lot about, but that positive reframe of, what do I need to do for myself now, not why. So HALT, a couple of big belly breaths, and what do I need to do for myself right now? And I'll leave it there if anyone has a few last thoughts or questions. And I know we're at time, and you're all so welcome. Thank you for the lovely and kind words. You're welcome. I hope this was super helpful, and let us know, and keep giving us feedback as far as what would be helpful, what information you'd like to see. And this is sort of our first introduction into the body and trauma, and what else you'd like Switch to do, because I know Switch is putting out products all the time, and we're always looking for people to give us feedback, especially about trauma. So thank you all so much for joining us. Stay well and healthy, and with that, lots of love. Take care.